Hi, Jeremy asked in the forum if there is a way to batch export markers from Premiere Pro with automation blocks. And yes, we have a tool ready to use to do this, to export all markers of the active sequence, but Jeremy wants to go one step further and wants to export the markers of all sequences because he has many sequences in his project. So let's see how we can do this with all sequences or all selected sequences or something like that. Here we are in Premiere Pro, and let's first start under extensions automation blocks once it's installed. And if you search here in the library for markers, you can see we've got various tools for markers. Let me make some more space here. And the one we want to use is to export markers to Spreadsheet, which is this one here. And by default, this is super easy. You just pick a file to which you want to save it. So to keep it simple, on my desktop, I just want to create here a file, markers.csv. And now you can see in my active sequence, I have here 3 markers. You can also see them in the markers panel, and they have names, and they have comments, and they have colors, and this one here also has a particular duration. And if we now run the tool, it says done. And now on our desktop, we find a file markers.csv. And if we take a look, this is a spreadsheet that you can open in any spreadsheet application. And from all your markers, it contains their name, comment, the type of marker it is. In this case, these are all comment markers, start, end time, duration, and color. And now we want to export this not only for the active sequence, but for all sequences. So you can see that here I have multiple sequences in my project, and all of them have different markers. So let's dive into the code of this and see how we can manipulate it to consider all sequences. So this is a great thing about automation blocks. It does not just come with a ton of ready-to-use automations for all kinds of tasks, but you can also modify them. If it's not doing 100% what you're doing, no problem, you can adjust it. So we go here to the script tab of automation blocks once this export markers to spreadsheet, which we used, is selected, and we go here, and now we can modify the code of this. And let me double click on automation blocks here to make the window a bit bigger. And you can see that the code consists of these blocks that you can easily adjust. This is just the description of the tool. Here is a link to a tutorial, how to use it. You can click here on this play button to open it or cut and paste this URL. Here is like the main block of the code. And here are details of what this block is actually doing. So this is the export sequence markers as spreadsheet block, the main block of this script. And here are the details what this exactly means. We get to this in a second. The reason why most automation blocks scripts are structured this way is because often you don't even need to look at the details. Because take a look here. What is the main script doing? It's creating an input of type label, which says export sequence markers of active sequence. This just prints this text here, and then it calls this block to actually export the sequence markers to a spreadsheet file. And what you can choose here is which spreadsheet file and which sequence, okay? And so at this level, we don't even need to know the details of how it's exporting the sequence, but what we want to do is we want to call this block here now not just once, but many, many times, namely for every sequence. Yeah? So what we need to do for this is to loop over the items of your project. So in other words, here in your project, you've got many, many items, bins, and inside these bins, for example, footage items, and you've got these sequences. And we want to look at all those items, find the ones that are sequences, and then call this block for all of them. Yeah? So we want to work with project items, so we go to the PR project items category here, and here the green blocks are always the loops. And you see here it says for each item as my item. And this is what we need. We need to do something for each item. Now, what do we need to do for each item? First of all, or for which items do we need to do something? Let's clarify this first. We want to only process sequences, so we just uncheck everything else here. Now we will do something only for the sequence items of the project. And if you only want to process the selected ones, you can keep this here checked. Otherwise, you uncheck this. Yeah. Now it's processing all sequences, and now it's only processing the selected sequences. And where you can also filter this. Currently it says in the bin and subbins empty here, nothing. Yeah. So by default it processes now all sequences. And you could now also refine this a bit more if you say we only want, let me just make this a bit smaller, we want to process only everything inside the bin sequences here. Then you could just click here this refresh and it enters / sequences here, which means in the bin sequences. Yeah, in the bin sequences and its subbins, you can also say just inside this bin. If I remove this here again, this would mean please process all sequences in the root bin of the project, but not in any other subbins like these ones here. Yeah. So this is not what we want. We want to have it in the root bin and all subbins, which means everywhere in the project. Yeah, everywhere in the project we want to select, we want to process the selected sequences or the selected sequence items. Okay. Now the next thing after we decided what do we actually want to process is what do we do with all those sequences. Yeah, and everything you want to do with those sequences, you just plug here in this inner, in this empty space that you have here. Yeah. So this says do something with all these sequences, and what you want to do, you just plug in here. Well, what we want to do is this here, exporting the sequence markers. Yeah. So we just plug it in here. And now, if you've got let's say 3 sequences selected, then it will execute this block here 3 times. And let me just move this down a bit and a comment for it too. And plug this in here. So now, if we've got 3 sequences, this export will not be executed once, but it will be executed 3 times. But the problem is, it will 3 times still export the active sequence. Right? Because this is the sequence that is decided here. This says, look at every sequence, and then for each one you find, please export the markers of the active sequence. Of course, we don't want to do this. So instead of having the active sequence here, we want to have the respective sequence here that this block is looking at. Yeah, and this is my item. It says for each item as my item, which means you can now use my item inside here, inside this entire part, to say this is the item I'm currently looking at. This is a sequence in this case that I'm currently looking at. So in variables, we find now this variable my item, which has automatically been created after I inserted this green block. And now we say for all sequences, all selected sequences in our project, execute this code, and as sequence, please use the items that we are currently looking at. So in the first run, use the first selected sequence. In the second run, use the second selected sequence. In the third one, use the third selected sequence, and so on. This is the main change we need to do to make this thing process all sequences. But let's, to be sure, take a look at the details of what this exporting sequence markers is actually doing. So we expand this block. I right-clicked on it and say expand block, and you can see it is doing the following. It is deleting the spreadsheet file, then it's adding a row to the spreadsheet, namely a header row, yeah, where it inserts the marker name, the type, the comment, the start, and duration and colors. Just these texts are added. If we take a look here at our spreadsheet file again, this is this first row here, marker name, type, comment, start, and duration and color. And after that, you find again such a green block, which is such a loop block, as I explained. This time it's not looping over all project items, but it's looping over all markers of the sequence that we're currently looking at. And then it's adding a row to the spreadsheet for each of them. So for each marker it finds, it adds another row. So here it adds the header row, and here it adds a row for each marker that has been found. Now the one thing that you might find suspicious is why is it deleting the spreadsheet file at the very beginning? This is because if the spreadsheet file already exists, it does not want to append to the existing spreadsheet file, but it wants to create a new one. Yeah. But in our case, we don't want to delete it every time, because think about it. If we export the markers of the first sequence and write this file, then for the second sequence, the file will already exist, and we definitely don't want to delete it. We want to keep the data we have from the first one. Yeah. So therefore, what we want to do is we want to right-click here and disable this block. Or we can also delete it entirely if we want, but it's enough to disable it. So this means if this block is called the first time for this first sequence, yeah, it adds the rows for the first sequence, and then when it's called the second time, it adds the one for the second sequence without deleting what has already been there for the first one. Let's just try this and run our script. Oh, and before this, I need to choose here again the file we want to save to. Let's save this to markers all sequences. Save. Now we want to be sure that we have some sequences actually selected, and we run our tool. If we now open this spreadsheet file, you can see it first adds the header row, then it adds the markers of the first sequence that it processed. These were these three markers here, name 1, name 2, name 3. Then it again starts with a header row, because the entire project process starts again from scratch, right? So the same process now done for the second sequence. And now here are coming the markers for the second sequence, and here you've got a third copy of the header row, and then the markers of the third sequence. Why is the header row inserted multiple times at the beginning of each new sequence? Well, because in our block code here, we have that before we insert rows for the actual data, we always at the beginning add the header row, and this happens each time this block is executed. So for each sequence, yeah, this might be actually quite nice, because if you do this, then you know where the markers of the next sequence start, but maybe you also want to separate it in some different way. Yeah, maybe you just want to have something like the sequence name here at the beginning. Yeah, so let's say we duplicate this block here and disable the first copy. This is a great way to keep the original, so to speak, as a reference. But let's say at this point we don't want to insert the entire data here, but instead the only thing we want to insert is here at cell 1. We say markers of sequence, and then here as a second we put the sequence itself. So I just take it from here, the sequence. Yeah, this is like for each marker of the sequence that we're currently processing. This is a sequence, so I just take this, duplicate, and drag it in here. So this sequence is whatever the user plugged in here. So it's a currently processed sequence. Yeah. So we say here markers of sequence. This is a row we want to insert, just filling cells A and B, and everything else stays empty here. If we run this now, and now since we decided we don't want to delete the spreadsheet file here, we would need to delete it manually, otherwise it would be appended. Yeah. So we delete this file, make sure it doesn't exist. And now we can run our script again. And if we now take a look, we've got the file again. And this time it says markers of sequence. And now in the project get started 2 project, that's the actual name of my project right now. In the bin sequences, the sequence 01. That's just the name of the sequence. Yeah. And now it says markers of sequence get started blah 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 sequence 2. And here are the markers of the third sequence. Yeah, markers of the first sequence, markers of the second sequence, markers of the third sequence. Note that here in the second sequence, we obviously just have no names. This is not a bug or something. This is just really in the second sequence. Let's verify this. Yeah, in the second sequence, these markers have no names specified. So nothing to worry about here. Now maybe you don't want to have this full path here with project name, bin name, and name of the sequence. Maybe you just want the name of the sequence here. Okay. It really depends on what you want. You can totally do that. So we can go here where we insert this row, markers of sequence and sequence name. Let me just make this a little bit bigger again. And now say we don't want to put the actual sequence object here. The sequence object contains everything Automation Blocks needs to find the sequence. This is why it contains a project name and the bin where it is and the name and so on. But we just want the name of the sequence. So we go here to PR sequence and say get attribute of sequence. And you say see the default attributes already the name. You could print all kinds of things here, the duration of the sequence, I don't know, the frame height of the sequence, whatever you want, but we just want the name of this sequence. So we plug this in here. So now we delete our file here again and run the script and check what happened. Oh, it looks like we only exported the markers of sequence 2. I bet that I only have sequence 2 selected. Yeah, right now I have only sequence 2 selected. So we can select all sequences, or I also show you this second use case where I say we don't want to loop over the selected sequences, but actually all of them. And again, we have to delete the original one, run the script, and now you can see we only have the sequence name here. Markers of sequence 1, markers of sequence 2, and markers of sequence 3. If we want to have it be plotted a bit more nice, maybe we even want to have an empty row here in between. So this means we could also duplicate this here again and just leave everything empty, which will add an empty row. Oh, pretty nice. I just noticed we don't need to delete our files manually. It just asks, do you want to overwrite the file? And we say yes. And why is this happening? Because here this input dialog has this option to say, if file already exists, delete it after confirmation. So this is great. This means that this delete block here is actually not even necessary at all, which is pretty cool. So we made everything a little bit more complex than needed. And now you can see that after markers of sequence 1, we've got this empty line. Markers of sequence 2, empty line. Oh, and I think we actually want it the other way around, right? We want to have the empty line before the markers of sequence thing. So we just getting out here a block in the middle is a bit tedious. You first need to remove everything that's below it. Now you can remove this, plug this in again, and insert this on top. So now when a new spreadsheet, when a new sequence starts, we first enter an empty row, then the row markers of sequence blah blah blah, and then the actual markers content. Run the tool, confirm that we want to delete the old file, and now we've got here markers of all sequences. Of course, also at the before the first sequence you have an empty row, but I guess you can live with that. So markers of sequence 1, markers of sequence 2, markers of sequence 3, and here's all your data. So let me just save this such that I can add it to the community library for you. So the community library is a big repository of scripts on top of the official library, where we add more and more Automation Blocks tools over time. And it's got here the markers section, and in the markers section, let's see, we don't have an import-export section yet, so let's call this import-export. And we say export markers to spreadsheet, not copy, but let's call this export markers of all sequences to, and let's call this to single spreadsheet, because currently everything is inserted in a single one, right? And again, you find this script now later in the community library at that folder. And if you wonder where to find the community library, just click here on More from Community to get those details. But now I also want to cover the case where I say we do not just want to save to a single file, but to multiple files, so one file per sequence. Yeah. How can we do this? Well, here in our main code, at this point, we decide what's the name of the spreadsheet file to which should be exported. Currently, it is whatever you insert here. Yeah, whatever you pick here, because this is what this block creates. It creates a user interface, an input of type save file. But what we want to do now is we want to just be able to pick not a single file, but a folder, and then in this folder we want to create many spreadsheet files. Yeah, so we delete this input here. Actually, we don't really need to delete it. I can undo, because the only thing we need to do is to change the type of this. Yeah, we do not want to save a file, but we want to choose a folder with a label. Let's call this output folder. And as you can see, as I type here, this also changes output folder. Yeah, and now the folder is not yet our file, right? In this folder, we want to create a file. So we need to modify this, and we best do this. I always like to use this block for text manipulation. So let me quickly explain this. This is a block which takes some text and inserts other texts in it. So this would result in Mr. and $1 is Miller. So it would say Mr. Miller and $2 is 41. So it says Mr. Miller is 41 years old. This would be the result of this block. What does this have to do with our file here? Well, we want to create a text here, not just with names and numbers, but with our folder input and with the name of the sequence. Yeah, how do we find the name of the sequence? The sequence we are processing is my item. So let's steal this. And from the sequence, we want to use the name. So again, we get the attribute name of it. Get attribute name of my item. This gives us a sequence name. Yeah. And now our full file path would be the folder, which is $1. The folder is dot and $1. Yeah. And then slash, if we just do $2.csv, then it would create a CSV file with the name of the sequence. We could also write here markers of $2, which would create a file named markers of sequence 1, markers of sequence 2, whatever your sequence name is. Okay. And we plug this in here as spreadsheet file now. I know this gets a bit weird, but this is how automation blocks works. Yeah, you can plug in everywhere, every block you like, and here we just plugged in now blocks which create our folder name or our file name dynamically, like taking the folder from here, appending the text markers of, and then appending the name of the sequence, and then appending the file suffix CSV such that it's a proper spreadsheet file. And now we can also clean up this here, because most likely we don't want to, it cannot hurt now to delete this file. So we enable this again, because now we create many files, and we don't have the file delete check here in our input anymore, because it's not a file input but a folder input anymore. Yeah. It also does not hurt now to add the header row at the very beginning. We don't need to add this empty row anymore, and we don't need to enter the row with the sequence name anymore, because we have the sequence name now already in our file name, right? We've got to create separate files for each sequence. So I think now we should be done with, we save this as export markers of all sequences to individual spreadsheet files. Okay. Let's just check if this is working. We run our tool. And check. And oh, this didn't actually work because we didn't pick an output folder. So we choose a folder here, but let's first check if we got an error. Yeah, it returned an error when running the script. Please enter a folder path. Okay, so we select here a folder path, and by the way, why did it enter this error? Because in our input we've got this, if no folder has been chosen, stop with error. So we choose a folder, so just using here the desktop is fine in my case, and I run the tool. In this case, now you can see we've got markers of sequence 1, markers of sequence 2, markers of sequence 3. All of them have their nice header row and then the data for the sequence. And it also created markers of Adobe stock blah blah blah. So it looks like in my project somewhere else I also have this sequence. Let's check. Yeah, here I've got an extra sequence, and even this one was exported because we've got this option to export all sequences, right? Let's do one tiny refinement finally, and this is, wouldn't it be cool if we could choose here in the user interface if we want to have all items or only the selected items? Yeah, currently we can change this here in the block code by switching this checkbox. Yeah, when we loop over all items, you can say here, do we want to have selected ones or all of them? We can simply create a user interface element for this. We say input of type checkbox. Yeah, and now we've got here this checkbox, my label, which you can turn on and off. And let's say by default we've got it enabled, and say with label process only selected sequences. And now we can just plug this in here. So instead of enabling this checkbox manually, now you've got this outsourced, so to speak, to this panel. Now it's processing all sequences, and now it's processing only the selected sequences. Maybe we can make the label a bit smaller such that the new UI looks nicer. Only selected sequences. Export sequence markers of this active sequences. Also not a great label anymore. We just call this of sequences. Export sequence markers of sequences. Okay, save. So that's how you can export the markers of all sequences of your project super easily. Again, this was a bit of playing around with the blocks. I did all of this in detail here to show you how in general you approach these kinds of optimizing, changing the block code according to your needs. But I will save the ready-to-use scripts in the community library, so you don't need to go through all of this again and again, but you just can download the scripts from the community library and use them directly. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'm Matthias from mamoworld.com, and I'm looking forward to see you in the next tutorial.